everybody. Hello, dear students, and hello to all the viewers that are interested in the history of graphic design. I am Maria Chernat, your host, and with me is Frank Myong, a graphic designer. So you have a teacher who deals with the history of graphic design and somebody who actually makes a living out of graphic design. Thank you for being here with us, Frank.
I'm grateful to be with you.
Okay, so let us dive straight in and discuss a little bit about the history of graphic design. I invited Frank to give us a perspective of someone who, as I told you, actually makes a living out of it. And I will be starting to share my screen, of course, and discuss a little bit about the beginnings of graphic design. I'm very much in depth to Professor Jeremy Ainslie, who wrote a wonderful book, Century of Graphic Design. It is one of the few books that deals with the history of graphic design from a very nuanced and complex perspective, explaining the social, economic, and political forces that drove the main changes in the history of graphic design. Now, just to introduce you to this wonderful field of study, I will mention something very important. Graphic design as we know it today existed, and it existed for centuries and even for millennia, if we think that actually the Chinese had labels for everything. But it took the humanity a long time to reach the stage where we have a consumer society, meaning that enough people have enough money to buy goods, and they buy goods also taking as a main criterion in their decision the way those goods look like. And this happened only in the 20th century, when we had the Industrial Revolution, when we have a mass consumer society. Of course, it started in the 19th century, but it went and it became really serious, and we had schools of graphic designs open for the public in the 20th century, the beginning of the century. And it is no surprise then that it was in 1922 that even the term graphic design was first coined by this designer, a very interesting one that is called William Anderson Dwiggins. And it is very important to stress here about graphic design, the fact that there are two main directions. Because, you know, when you talk about design, you have design in fashion, that is clothing. You have designs even in microphones like the ones I use here. You have design everywhere because the shape and the way you package things is very important. But graphic design has a specific meaning, and it usually covers the areas of designing fonts, typefaces that you use in writing. And it is very interesting to note that the ones you use, for instance, in Word, were not there from the beginning of time. Somebody drew those fonts, and somebody thought about drawing and designing those fonts. So this is one important area of graphic design. And another one, of course, is illustration, image, as a broad term that we use in this field of graphic design. And I want to ask Frank, is this business of designing fonts still very vivid and important today as it was before?
Yes, indeed, it is. For example, most of the Hollywood movies have their own font designs. If you remember Harry Potter, usually some of them are based on fonts that exist, but are modified. But sometimes, for example, Star Trek has completely new designed font, which is very simple, which is based on on fonts that the German school, which is called Bauhaus, started in the 30s, but maybe this will be more interesting later because you will talk about that. So what is important and what I want to say here is that it evolves, and each typeface is somehow producing a next generation of something that was created before. So it follows some kind of evolution. And I don't know what we'll have in the nearest future. We will see.
I want to tell you also that it is very often, and it's not unusual, that the graphic designers are very talented people that come from areas like paintings or music or something that has to do with art. And Dwiggins was no exception to that rule. He actually designed and he actually built these puppets that he used to stage representations of his own puppet shows in Massachusetts. And it was interesting that those puppets that he created are still kept in art museums. And I just wanted to say that basically graphic design is not or design in general is not strictly related to what I said, but it is important to note that when we talk about graphic design, we refer actually to fonts and images. Now, going back just a little bit, well, you see here, I have an image of something that was used a long, long time ago, the linotype machine, that was used to print text on paper using hot metal. And it was a company that took this invention and marketed this type of machines at the beginning of the century. And now, as you may see it, it looks so, how should I say, primitive, isn't it? And it looks so primitive compared to what? Because before that, there were no such machines. So it was a revolution compared to the printers today that we use. Well, of course, it looks very primitive. But at the time, at the beginning of the century, it was something that allowed graphic design to flourish, to prosper. And you told me that you had something in your family that
Yes,
worked.
my grandfather was a printer, but it was some kind of prolonging of this linotype method because they use this small letter um, faces, typefaces. And which is it interesting that we now in the computer, in the Word program, for example, we can change the size of the type, whatever we wish, whatever we like. But back then, when everything was analog, you should find special, metal clips that with this typeface, which are, for example, I don't know, 2 points, 3 points, 5 points, and stuff. The headers, the titles were actually very big blocks of with letters, with metal faces. And I wanted to add something, but because at the beginning, actually, the print was invented in China, they say, and the first matrices which were used for printing were made from wood. For example, in China, they were just big wooden blocks, and they, put in ink and then on paper. The process, because the Chinese were also the first to have paper, because the paper was invented in China, as they say. So it was used in imperial documents in China, and then it came to Europe.
Of course, but it's interesting also to note and is that we say that Gutenberg invented, the printer, and he,
Gutenberg in Europe.
of course, he
Invented in
invented
Europe,
that.
and
But what is
also, because
interesting,
I told you in China it was only stamps, but Gutenberg invented a whole pages. So the whole pages to be printed should be first carved from wood. So he had this wooden matrix, which was used for a whole page, and then next, right? And then you build uh, a whole book. But it was even then it was much cheaper than to give to a person to just
Yes,
to
to write
write
it
a
by hand
book
because it took
by
a long,
hand,
long
and
time.
it was much faster
Of course
because
it was.
written it by
But
hand was
what I
very
wanted to say and to stress here is that basically you see that technological advances by themselves mean nothing. You would have needed a population that was educated. So you needed some sort of revolution in mentality in order to have this type of technological revolution actually making a change in society, isn't it? Because
Yes, of
you
course.
have you had to have educated people, because before that you had illiterate people, and even though you had the possibility of having a mechanized reproduction of books and selling them cheap, you didn't have a market, you didn't have consumers. And it is interesting that it took centuries to get to that point.
In the Middle Ages, most of the people were illiterate, and it's not because it was expensive or something. It was a matter of power, matter of
Yes,
religion.
yes,
The church people were educated; they could
yes.
read and
Only the
write.
clergy had
So
access to that
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of knowledge.
But I want to mention something because you see this written books. You have design also there because they're painted. Some of them with gold, with colors. So this is also design, which is unique, and you
Yes, of
still have it
course.
there.
But
You
what is
still have
also
it there.
interesting that the revolutions in design, thank you for saying that the revolutions in design actually were against this type of having only one type of printing the books, and especially the futurist movement was famous for challenging, and also the other ones were famous for challenging this type of seeing the way to print books in a very narrow perspective. Now, I also wanted to give just an example. The Metro family of typefaces sans serif. It means that they have no endings here, because when you open a Google document and you look at Times New Roman, for instance, the thickness of the letter, if you look at it, is different, is not the same, and it also has an ending. So he invented that. It is important to stress these things related to designs and the beginnings of designs. Now, another important thing to note here: at the beginning of the century, since the whole conflict between, I think the bourgeoisie and the powerful feudal elites was not over, what was related to commercial enterprises was considered very trivial, even barbaric, and it was somehow considered to be cheap. And this is why the design had negative connotations. And it was also, as Frank so cleverly intuited, it was a question of power. I mean, if you painted, say you were a painter and you were summoned by, I don't know, the Lord of the Manor, or maybe some powerful member of the royal family in Britain to paint a painting, a portrait of some of those members of the family, you would have been considered an artist. But if you were designing, I don't know, labels or typefaces or things that were designed for the popular masses, you were considered cheap and you were considered very I don't know, not to be taken seriously. Is this, I don't know. I don't think this type of division still persists today. What do you think, Frank?
My mother is constantly asking me, "What do you do for a living?" And I say that I'm a designer. And she said, "Aha, yeah, this is something that has to do with computers, right?" And I say, "Yes, yes, because people usually are mistaking, designers with IT, and for them we are writing programs, not creating ads."
Yes,
Uh,
but the negative aspect of it doesn't persist. They don't consider that
of
it's something
course,
cheap, but they
yeah,
don't consider it art, isn't it?
yeah. Yes, yes, of course, because you have to know, actually, you have to learn a lot of art history. And, with my knowledge, after this 20 years I've been working this craft, I will say that I'm cultural anthropologist, because, you need this knowledge in order to be good. Of course, I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I'm the hyper guru that it can exist. But sometimes, if you want to be more creative, you have to learn more to have bigger knowledge. So this is very important, and that's for we need to evolve constantly to
Yes,
learn.
well, the designers fought back, and in 1914 they created the tools for their job to become socially accepted. And in 1914, right at the first of the at the beginning of the First World War, something very first World War One, something very interesting happened. They created what is called the American Institute of Graphic Arts, and they formed this type of organization in their having as a main goal their desire to make graphic design a socially accepted job and a socially accepted thing, because back then, as I told you, it had negative connotations. And they also invented the art directors club now at the beginning of the century, and even now in some advertising companies those who work in design are called art directors, and they formed in 1920 this club that held an annual exhibition where they even discussed and offered some prizes for the posters that were the most important. But these were tools to make the graphic design a respectable and an accepted, socially accepted profession. Now, they also had other tools because the other tools that they used in order to gain respectability were the publications that were devoted to design. And this one, Le Maître de l'Affiche, the masters of posters, so that collected the most beautiful posters at the beginning of the century, was published. And also we have here this one, the poster, and also we have here in Germany, Das Plakat, another. And what is important to note that another thing to stress here, what do we see? All these publications and the graphic design in general was a profession of the global north, as we call it in the decolonial theory today. It was not something to appear in the countries that were poor. It appeared in the highly industrialized societies that allowed the formation of the consumer society. So, as Jeremy Anshley says in his book, A Century of Graphic Design, it is a first world profession. It was developed as we know it today in these countries, the ex-colonial powers. And they were the ones to publish this type of magazines. Now, There are generations of magazines. Let's say that the ones that I showed you here belong to the first generations. These are among the first to be published as magazine devoted to the profession of graphic design, to the presentation and to the analysis and discussion of the most important posters. Then you had the interwar period. Even more specialized magazine began to appear, and it was an increased interest in this field. I gave you here just two examples. One that appeared graphic arts, and another one Gebrauchsgrafik that appeared in the interwar period. And now we have the third generation, so to speak, of magazines that are devoted to designs. Now, this one, Graphics, is very beautiful, and I always recommend my students to look it up because it publishes. We can also um, see a screenshot from today. They are still publishing, and they are publishing portfolios. And for those who are just starting design and are passionate about it, is the place to go because it is a very beautiful. I will now stop sharing the screen, and I will share the screen completely because I just want to show you how beautiful it is and to give this indication that you can check it up. So Graphics magazine. You can see it here. And now we have portfolios. And now we have here the famous David Ogilvy with the students that I'm also discussing Introduction to Advertising. We know that it is a man that started his adventure in advertising when he was almost 40 years old. And he was famous. I mean, this was the poster that gave him the access to fame. He was summoned and he was hired by Hathaway Company to sell a shirt. And as I often tell my students, and I think you agree, Frank, I mean, when you have a product that is interesting in itself, and let's say this microphone is a new invention, and I don't know, it has the possibility to make my voice 10 times more beautiful than it already is. It will be easier to sell it. But when you have something so trivial like a shirt, a white shirt, how do you sell it? And he had this wonderful idea of just putting this
Eye
thing,
patch.
yes, this eye patch on his face, and it was a hit. I mean, everybody started buying the shirt, and the man in the Hathaway shirt was basically the thing that made him famous. Now you have here all sorts of designers that upload their portfolios, the thing that they worked on, and you can check it out because they are very vivid, interesting, powerful, and
They serve their purpose.
and they serve a purpose.
But we call them stocks or stocks. It depends
You
on,
see,
is it the British
America,
pronunciation or the German pronunciation? Because, in advertising agencies, sometimes people need inspiration. And, it was very popular at the beginning of the 90s because after the communist era, we don't have these schools for designers in Eastern Europe. So they were constantly feeding us with these stocks. And, there were, a bunch of people who were, had, for example, design, problem, and they were going through the stocks to find something inspiring or to check up if somebody already did, or had the same idea. So it is important for us, I think, the stocks, the portfolios of, people who already do this
these are very human.
type, of work. But of course, it have to serve the purpose. You want to sell something with these images. So it
Yes,
depends.
of course.
It depends what. Yeah.
This one.
Opus is actually very good. One of the best uh, brands for this, earphones and microphones and loudspeakers. One of the best, really, very high level. Well, it's medium level, but very professional
Mhm,
style.
mhm. So basically, this is also a copy of print that is still being printed today, is still being published today. I mean, this is a copy from 1940. This is a copy from last year. You should also check it out because they have a lot of debates and discussions on the current trends. Now, of course, the digital revolution meant a lot for the graphic design, and it really was a revolution. And the thing that caught my attention was that a lot of women entered the world of graphic design when it was more accessible. When the digital revolution came, it is interesting to see and to make a correlation between the graphic designers that were women and this revolution. Because before that, what is interesting to note is that it was a pretty exclusive club and not many women were part of it. Do you experience that in your field? I mean, you worked in this field for 20 years. Is there a gender balance or not?
Well, to be honest, well, we are in this specific area, which is, Eastern Europe. We live in Eastern Europe. So, we have this different culture than in Western countries. But I think at the beginning, I had only colleagues, mostly men. Because I think because I think they were the first because everything was related to computers. But let me tell you one more interesting fact. Why is this revolution in the 80s? Because you see here Apple Macintosh 1984, and what is important here? That in this year, uh, Adobe created something that is called PostScript uh, fonts or PostScript fonts or PostScript technology. That meant that you could print what you see uh, on your screen, because before that printers were the printers which are coming straight from which were plugged into a computer were usually, this Epson printers which you use these needles to print on, the dot printers, but Apple Macintosh and together with Adobe invented the PostScript printers, which are based on vector fonts and which don't have, there is no difference of how large the letter will be, because the digital representation of a letter are not pixels, but vectors. That means mathematically described, shapes that are used for printing. And,
Mhm.
it doesn't matter how big the font will be, the quality will be always the same. So this is very important and revolutionary, because then, what we have today, actually PDF, this file that you are using right now, is the next generation of PostScript, because you can see it and you can interact with it. But before that, it was the PostScript files were only put in the machines which created the plates and stuff. But this is not important. Maybe next time I will explain that.
I wanted also to say that what is interesting is that it was a woman that was a visionary. She was the art director that she was hired at that MIT Press, and she actually had a course. She taught that, and she actually wrote that graphic design will be dominated by the computers, and she did that before the digital revolution was gain momentum.
You mean she
Okay,
made a
now I discussed here and I focused on the ones that tried and used design to try to sell consumer goods and try to sell those consumers to a consumer society. Now, not everybody agreed with this role of the designer. there were dissident voices, and as Jeremy Ashley puts it, there were people that did not agree with this perspective of the designer being hired by the corporation in order to sell things, and with this idea of selling their talents, the designer selling his or her talents to a company. Why? Because it was a different problem. At the beginning of the century, as I discussed, the problem was that the graphic design was considered something cheap. Now, the graphic design was considered something immoral because they consider that selling your talents to companies in order to sell consumer goods is only strengthening capitalism and the world we live in. And while this may be very easy to say, it's very hard to apply, because how else would you gain your existence? How else would you gain money if not by doing that? Well, there was this movement of designers, and it is no coincidence that they were formed in 1968 when the flower power revolution took place, and the global north and especially the western countries were swept by huge mass movements, student movements, contesting basically the consumerist society and capitalism and American imperialism. They were fighting against and they were protesting against the Vietnam War, but also, because this is not very clear, because my students knew that back then students were protesting against the Vietnam War, but they were so surprised to find out that they were protesting capitalism also, and they were protesting consumerism. This collective of designers, they even sign all their creations using this title, Graphos. They didn't sign with their own name because they believed in the power of the collective movement of designers and not of the designer as a creator of art and then becoming some sort of master and some sort of celebrity. And they also worked exclusively, and they made it their goal in life to work exclusively for the causes, the social causes they supported. And now you have here what they created, one of their famous designs that also Jeremy Ashley presents in his book, that is a bottle of cola in the form of a Molotov cocktail, suggesting that they are protesting basically the consumer society and the idea that they have to sell their talents in order to serve this type of society that they didn't believe in. So I also happen to know, Frank, that you are somehow politically engaged and you are not a big fan of capitalism. So how do you deal with this problem that you have to work for a system that you don't necessarily believe in?
Well, it's difficult to say because, my political view is a bit hybrid because, I would say that I'm a central leftist because, you need goods to create goods for now because, the system around us uh, is built that way. But of course, in the far future, we can, when the goods will be created somehow artificially without money, then we can think about something else. Or we, in the closest, I don't know, 10 to 15 years, we will have artificial intelligence, but not, the way we have it today, because we already have it, but an independent artificial intelligence. And we don't know what this will create. And then also, because the science now is rapidly going ahead, is forcing its way of inventions. So it's very hard to predict what will happen in the closest future. But of course, what I don't like and I am working against, and what I proclaim is that I don't think that people who have billions on their accounts uh, can use them till the end of their lives or till the end of the lives of their grandchildren. And this is something artificial and very, very unfair to all of the other peoples. So, in other words, I don't believe in this 1% of people who are, collecting the goods of the whole earth, of the whole,
But
of
let's say you were
human
hired
population.
by one of these people to promote these ideas. Would you accept?
And once again, because I didn't hear the.
Let's say that you are hired by one of these billionaires to promote his or her image. Would you accept?
Well, it
It
depends.
depends on the sum, isn't it? If they
Yeah,
give you.
it depends. But I would, first of all, I would never, receive offer from that kind of person, because there are some vultures who are, circling around this person, and they're actually in a cocoon, so it is very hard to reach through them. So, for example, Trump is a very small guy comparing to the big, big, huge people who are billionaires. The billion, the big billionaires, like, for example, Rockefeller or stuff. Actually, you don't know them all, because not all of them are listed. This is the most important thing. And
Yeah, and do you think there is no chance that something like that would happen, isn't it?
no, 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 no. Of course, right now we live in this capitalism society, and we have to somehow fit in, and to gain what is best for us. Of course, remembering our principles, and of course, fighting for our ideas.
Yes. Well, let us move on. So these were the first dissident voices. And then another important school of thought that was dissident and thought of design in a very different way. We are being taught this narrative that actually the Soviet Union was all bad. Everything that happened there was bad. Well, actually, what is interesting to see, and I was quite pleasantly surprised to discover a researcher that presented things from a different perspective and devoted her life to the Vuhtemas school, the Russian constructivist. It was a very, very interesting experiment that I am going to take some time to discuss in detail during this course, because I was so impressed about what they did there and how they thought about their activity and how they organized this design and art school in Moscow starting from 1918, and how this proved to be actually a very refreshing, new, liberating, and fruitful artistic experiment that allow a lot of people to think about art in a different way and to think about the role of art and the role of art in relation to the public. They wanted to bring art closer to the public. They wanted to transform the artistic experiment into something that was made for the public. And we may find this very trivial today, but back then it was a revolution. And of course, it is related to the Bolshevik revolution and to their revolutionary ideals. And as it turns out, actually in history, whenever there was a revolution, because just a quick note here, the Italian futurism that is related to Filippo Marinetti was related to fascism. He wrote the Fascist Manifesto and then he wrote the Futurist Manifesto, the same person, and it was a revolution in art. Okay, so this one, the Russian constructivism, was related to the Bolshevik Revolution, and it was actually a room and a space of experiment. They were organized at the beginning on very anarchist principles that they abandoned because it turned out to be too chaotic. But people like El Lissinsky, just to give you two examples, he was a very, very influential designer, and his work influenced the work of designers for decades to come. And it is a shame that actually the books on design, especially the ones written in the western part of the world, um, never took him or this experiment very seriously. So it is a good thing that we are overcoming and we are leaving behind the Cold War rhetoric where everything was bad and we have to ignore everything that happened in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. Another one, Alexander Rodchenko, very important designer that basically is famous. This one is one of the most famous posters that he ever created. He used lines, and we can see here what is also interesting to note here is that you don't need actually the latest computer or the latest, printers. You
Draw
need
line.
talent. You need talent and you need vision and you need passion in order to come up with very interesting pictures. We can see here that he used very sharp angles to take pictures, and this is one of the things that made him famous. So dissident voices, okay, these were not people that were trying to sell commodities and who actually fought against these tendencies of somehow making the art obedient in front of the companies and in front of the consumerism and in relation to the capitalist system.
I would add only one. I would like to add only one name to this list, and Sergei Eisenstein or Eisenstein. It depends how it is pronounced. He was a famous Soviet director, film director, which created a couple of films from that era, and he is now uh, studied by most of the directors around the world because of his unique style of intercutting scenes. And also, he was the one who created one of the first color images of the black and white, imagery of the films back then. So because he painted the flag red in the film, on the film. Of course, it was Méliès, the French, creator who was painting whole films, in ways. But this was one of the accents. So he was one of the first, and he was extremely, influential for later artists. And of course, Shostakovich as a composer. Because, to be an artist, you have to think differently. Yes, yes. You have to think differently. It's a whole philosophy around this image, what you are creating. And usually, artists are, as philosophers are connected to politics, and, they observe what is happening, around them. And actually, Gutenberg, the one of the first, printing, the inventor of print, was closely related to, to Martin Luther, who was, the uh, the father of,
the Protestant
yeah,
movement in
exactly.
religion. Yes, well, I wanted to say thank you very much for your observations. And yes, of course, I wanted to stress also this idea that we have this Cold War that imposed this very narrow and quite how should I say, naive perspective that everything that happened in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution and the USSR was
Terror.
bad
It's
and
terror.
terrible. But this was one example that it was not actually.
Yeah.
I talk about this book that was wrote by the French philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard that is called the postmodern condition. Now, it is very difficult to define postmodernism in one word, but I would say that it somehow opposes the idea that modernists had that they can create a universal language, because they wanted to create this type of language that would speak for everybody. Now, they came with the idea that we have to deconstruct actually this ideal and this very idea of monopolizing meaning and of somehow having unique meanings. And they are also known for having this type of irony and meta discourse. What do I mean by that? Well, they use uh, very powerful symbols and they transform them in a humoristic or even um, in a way that it's playing in a playful manner. I mean, we have just examples here because we have many examples in paintings, in movies, in literature. When you have like the Snow White and you transform it a little bit just to suggest that maybe she's just a tool of selling beauty stereotypes, or you do what these people did here, because you had the famous image of Uncle Sam summoning and selling the American soldiers the war, the First World War, 1917, when the Committee on Public Information was created by President Woodrow Wilson, and you had posters with a very charismatic figure. I want you for the US Army wants you, or I want you for the US Army. There were plenty of versions of that poster. And now he took Santa Claus, and he created a whole new meaning. They created a whole new meaning. I mean, these fellows here that are actually known as the Adbusters, because they take posters that were famous, symbols that are famous, like the one you told Frank last time, like the Santa Claus that was designed by Coca-Cola, and that poster that was designed in order to sell the word to the American public, and they transform it in a very humoristic way to convey another message. And this is basically one part of the postmodern tradition in a nutshell, if you look at it, because this is how they operate. They basically take very powerful symbols, they transform it in a somehow using irony, using this type of humoristic meta discourse in order to convey a completely new message. And you may say is a parasitic form of art because it uses basically very powerful symbols that were presented and were there in the public's mind, but they are changing those symbols and they are combining them. Now,
Well, I will compare this to the first hip hop artists, because they were using also already known and famous art pieces like I don't know, very often Donna Summer songs, and they created new stuff, new completely new songs, completely new sounds, which they added their own poetry and stuff. So I will compare that to this, because it's a new form by used and built on older forms.
yes, it is. Well, this is basically it for our first episode. Our time expired. We'll see you again in. Please subscribe to our channel. We are going to discuss also the main figures, the one that branded the term the one that branded basically the corporate and visual corporate identity. Who was he? Who was he hired by? And a lot of interesting things. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much, Frank, for being here with us. And I'll see you all very soon, I hope.
Me too.